Good afternoon, my name is Carl Sachs. Today we're going to talk about a brief history of the occurrence and diagnosis of PTSD and TBI. This is a subject that's very near and dear to a lot of our hearts based on our occupations. Here's what we're going to cover today: the definitions and symptoms of both PTSD and TBI, and then we're going to cover a timeline. This timeline will be divided into three distinct parts. We're going to cover ancient warfare through the mid-20th century, about the end of World War II. We're going to pick up there and go on to the 1980s, about the end of the 20th century. And then we're going to talk about current history, which is the 21st century. We're going to start approximately with the terrorist attack at the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001, and move on to present day. I'll take questions at any point. If anyone has any questions, you can see the references at the end of the presentation. What is PTSD? Post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental disorder brought on by an experience of extreme terror or feelings of helplessness or hopelessness. There are four main symptoms: reliving the event through nightmares and flashbacks. This is the one we're most familiar with through the movies and through our own experiences. Avoidance behavior. This is where you avoid any situations that remind you of the situation that caused the PTSD. If you were driving and you got into a severe accident, you may dislike driving now. If you were in a crowd and you suffered a mass casualty event, you may dislike crowds now and go out of your way to avoid them. Negative changes in behavior, when you feel irritability, despair, depression, anything of that nature. And then hyperarousal. This is jitteriness, when you're hyper alert, you're looking everywhere at once. You can't concentrate on any one thing because you're too busy looking at everything around you. TBI, traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury is an actual physical wound, actual damage to the brain through penetrating or non-penetrating force. Most of what we deal with is non-penetrating force. This includes overpressurization due to blasts, due to blunt force, something like concussion, etc. Symptoms include headaches or dizziness, blurred vision or ringing in the ears or tinnitus, sleeping too much, not sleeping enough, sleep problems in general. Changes in behavior, not necessarily negative. A lot of people have actually presented with changes in behavior that could be considered positive changes. And then slurred speech. So what's the difference? PTSD is a psychological disorder. It's a mental health disorder, where TBI is an actual physical wound, something that's physically damaged your brain. However, patients with TBI have approximately an 80% chance of developing PTSD later in their lives. There are a lot of similarities in the symptoms and in the treatments of both PTSD and TBI. In fact, someone being treated for PTSD who actually has TBI may respond to the treatments. Their TBI may respond to the treatments that they're receiving, even though those treatments were developed for PTSD and vice versa. Are there any questions so far? Moving on to our timeline. 490 BC, the Battle of Marathon. Herodotus, the Greek historian, saw the first recorded case of PTSD on the battlefield. A soldier was carried off the battlefield. He had no visible wounds whatsoever, but he had been struck blind in the middle of battle. That soldier actually never regained his sight. After the Battle of Marathon, between that time and the Civil War, there was very little discussion about PTSD throughout warfare or throughout the civilian sector in general. The reason for this is because at that time it was thought to be a defect in character. It was seen as cowardice, it was seen as a lack of strength or a lack of conviction. So even if soldiers were suffering from this, they very rarely sought any help. The U.S. Civil War, we started seeing not necessarily treatment, but at least acknowledgement of the issue. From 1861 to 1865, it was called irritable heart syndrome. This actually led to a lot of cases of alcoholism after the war. The first recorded case of widespread alcoholism in veteran soldiers was right after the United States Civil War. However, there was no treatment as such. Anyone who couldn't stay at home and be treated by their family was generally just consigned to the United States government insane asylum or other asylums. This moved us on to World War I. World War I was a very interesting time in the development of PTSD and TBI. We call it shell shock. A lot of people see shell shock as a precursor to PTSD. However, it's actually a precursor to both. It was an overarching diagnosis that covered both what we see today as PTSD and TBI. A lot of this was due to the invention of actual, truly modern artillery on the battlefield. The war, although it was less than 4 years long, was of sufficient duration and between enough industrialized nations to see us actually develop artillery throughout the war. The trench lines made a perfect place for static warfare, which allowed us to mass artillery in ways that we had never even dreamed possible scant years earlier. We developed the PI principle, okay? In 1914, psychologists and psychiatrists were first sent to the front lines to try and treat casualties of, again, what was at that time called shell shock. These psychologists and psychiatrists developed what we now know as the PI principle. The importance of this principle can't be overstated. PI principle simply states that the three important areas to consider when treating and looking at the recovery of PTSD and TBI victims is treatment in proximity to the injury, which means you don't move them back to the rear lines, you treat them on the front lines. Immediacy, as soon as possible after the event, you need to get that soldier into treatment. And then efficiency, belief in the efficiency of the treatment. The soldier has to believe that he's going to recover, otherwise it's very unlikely that he will recover.